This week on Unpacked, we're taking a look at the recent layoffs that hit the Marvel Rivals development team and the complexities surrounding it, discussing the hyperfocus on video game player counts from games media and pundits alike, and then wrapping up with some interesting tidbits that have come out from interviews with the now former president of SIE Worldwide Studios, Shuhei Yoshida, in his time at PlayStation. Another week, another round of layoffs. This time it's the Marvel Rivals team that was affected, which has led to quite the uproar as the game has been a major success for the company. It's a scenario where the layoffs really don't make sense, as the game is potentially going to earn NetEase over $1 billion in its first year. Games media and social media quickly reacted to the news, which stemmed from one of Marvel Rivals game directors, Thaddeus Sasser, announcing on LinkedIn that he and his team had been laid off by NetEase without explanation. Some important context here is that NetEase is based out of Hangzhou, China, which is also where the primary development team for Marvel Rivals is located. I reached out to some of the people affected by the layoffs and learned that in total, 6 people were laid off, which was the entirety of Marvel Rivals' North American division of developers via a support studio based out of Seattle. The Seattle team for Marvel Rivals was heavily focused on research and development, and some of the game's level design. Contrary to the original reports on this news, Sasser was not Marvel Rivals' primary game director, nor was the entire Marvel Rivals team laid off. The game's creative director title belongs to Guangyan Chen, and the layoffs did not affect the primary development team in China. In a statement to Video Games Chronicle, a representative from NetEase confirmed the news and said, "We recently made the difficult decision to adjust Marvel Rivals' development team structure for organizational reasons and to optimize development efficiency for the game. This resulted in a reduction of a design team based in Seattle that is part of a larger global design function in support of Marvel Rivals." Unfortunately for the developers involved in this story, this has less to do with the success of the game and more to do with factors completely outside of their control. If you haven't noticed, the United States isn't the most stable country in the world right now to do business. A big part of that is due to the government looking to impose increased tariffs on China. I'm highly unqualified to dig into that part of the story more deeply, but it has put a strain on companies like NetEase making investments in North America. NetEase in particular has been making a lot of investments in North American gaming studios over the past couple years, but recently has been pulling back from them, with speculation from multiple sources that the company could be looking to leave its North American investments behind entirely. 2 studios, who have yet to release their first games, were recently impacted by this, and had to essentially lay off their teams while trying to figure out their next steps: Worlds Untold and Jar of Sparks. Worlds Untold is a new studio founded in 2023 under the leadership of Mass Effect writer Mac Walters, and recently had to put their project on indefinite hold as they look for a new financial partner. Previously, the studio was a subsidiary of NetEase, but had their funding pulled. Jar of Sparks, founded in 2022, is in the same situation, as the studio had to put their project on hold following the exit of NetEase, and is now looking for a new publishing partner to keep their game alive. Now, the question is if NetEase's other North American studio partners will also be left out to dry. These studios include Bullet Farm, Anchor Point, T-0, and Bad Brain Game Studios, all of which were recently formed by industry veterans with funding from NetEase and working on new original titles. Unfortunately for so many of these new studios that formed during the COVID years when funding for new games and studios was plentiful, much of that money has now dried up, or the political landscape has shifted in a way that is causing disruptions from foreign investors. The NetEase situation will be one to watch closely as the year marches on to see how these studios fare. In the case of this story, however, Marvel Rivals isn't in trouble and is a major success story this year. In this case of layoffs very likely had more to do with global politics and trade wars than it has to do with the game itself, which is of course extremely unfortunate for the developers caught in the crossfire. Over the last few years, games media outlets, drama YouTubers, and players alike have been hyper-focused on day one player counts of video games on websites like SteamDB to decide whether a game is a success or a failure, and frankly, to weaponize these statistics for clickbait stories. I'm writing about this week to follow up on my coverage of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2's sales success, as the game has now surpassed 2 million copies in 2 weeks, and achieved a peak player count of more than 256,000 on Steam in its debut weekend. Mind you, this is only Steam's reported player count, since the game also launched on PS5 and Xbox, and has been in both stores' top sellers lists since release. The game is, in no uncertain terms, a big success, and reportedly, the game's budget was somewhere between $40 and $50 million US, which I was told is not far off by Daniel Vavra himself. I bring up the budget of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 because player counts don't tell the whole story on whether a game is a success or not, especially for single-player games. When I heard the budget for Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, I was actually quite surprised as the game, when compared to many of its more expensive peers, definitely felt like it cost a lot more to make. But then, you take into consideration the game wasn't made in the United States, or one of the more expensive Western European countries. It was made in the Czech Republic, where the cost of living is much more affordable. More often than not, when YouTubers and social media pundits are focused on player counts, they aren't taking into account all the different factors that go into a game's development that determine whether it's a success or not. They take a major success like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and try to compare those numbers to other games if they're really comparable without deeper insight. Things like where the game was made is a huge factor. How many people worked on the game, the different platforms it's available on, how much the publishers spend on marketing. I mean, really, it's an endless list of different factors that define a successful game for a studio. And budgets of games vary hugely, and tracking player counts for a single-player game on its day of release is a horrible way to determine how a game is truly doing. Not to mention, for single-player games, people can pick up and play them whenever they want, they can play them offline, and a peak player count is just a day's worth of data. Avowed, as of this writing, is the third best-selling game on Steam globally and has over 17,000 concurrent players. It's clearly not as popular as Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, but we also don't know how many people are playing on Xbox, or Battle.net, or through Game Pass on PC. We don't know the game's budget, how many new subscribers joined Game Pass on launch day. Nobody knows what's considered a success for Avowed right now. Obviously, different standards apply when looking at free-to-play live service games that need a steady stream of players constantly playing the game to actually earn money through microtransactions, and more people playing means more people are spending money. It's pretty clear when a game has tanked as well, as was the case with Concord last year, which failed to break even 1,000 concurrent players as a multiplayer game. So don't take this write-up as me telling you not to believe the numbers. In most cases, however, player counts are just one factor of how successful a game is. And I'm pretty tired of seeing them weaponized to proclaim a game a success or a failure without thinking about the other factors involved. This could be helped by developers and publishers being more transparent about the costs involved in making games, but that might be wishful thinking. Or, you can stop worrying about the numbers, go play the game you bought, hopefully enjoy it, and then tell your friends about it, which is a much more productive use of your time and energy. Since leaving Sony and PlayStation, former president of SIE World Studios, Shuhei Yoshida, has been making the rounds and providing games media with a lot of fascinating interviews about his time working at the company. He stopped by Last Stand Media's Sacred Symbols podcast this week and provided a ton of interesting tidbits about a variety of different topics, including what happened with the Last of Us multiplayer game Naughty Dog was working on, his thoughts on Xbox games going to PlayStation, and some insight into PlayStation's live service plans. It's a fantastic interview and well worth your time. One of the more interesting talking points from the interview was some behind-the-scenes business details regarding Demon's Souls and Dark Souls. If you recall, Demon's Souls was a PlayStation exclusive at launch, published by Sony in Japan and Atlus in the West. According to Yoshida, playtests for Demon's Souls were quite negative due to the game's difficulty, and he personally did not find enjoyment in it. Thus, Sony decided not to localize it in the West, and Atlus published the game for From Software outside of Japan instead. This was a decision Yoshida and Sony would obviously come to regret. Sony wanted to work with From Software on the sequel to Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, but From Software decided to go with Namco Bandai instead because of Sony's treatment of Demon's Souls. And as we all know, the series is now beloved, and Elden Ring took that formula to mainstream appeal. In another moment of reflection from Yoshida, he also talked about the closure of PlayStation's Japan studio in April 2021. As Yoshida explained, the studio really just wasn't making the games that Sony was interested in at the time, mainly mid-sized games with more niche appeal, such as the cult classic Gravity Rush series, among others. The AA market had shrunk considerably over the years, and Sony was primarily focused on making AAA experiences according to Yoshida. As for their market in Japan, Gran Turismo was really their only big success for them there, and while he found the concepts that Japan studio pitched interesting, ultimately they didn't greenlight them and the studio was closed. It's an interesting reflection as the industry's AA market is making a pretty big comeback just a few years later due to the immense amount of layoffs in the games industry across the board, budgets for projects that were out of control, an oversaturation of low-budget indie games, and subscription services causing gamers to be more picky in the games they actually spend their money on. Sony's overfocus on live service projects has also forced them into many game cancellations and layoffs over the last few years. On the other hand, Sony's own team Asobi put out a mid-sized game in Astrobot last year and took home many awards for their efforts. It's probably a good time to mention that the developers behind Patapon are gearing up to release a spiritual successor that was a big hit on Kickstarter a couple years ago, Rataton. So maybe there is a market for these games, just not with the expectations of a major corporation behind them. Unfortunately, another week, another story about layoffs. Thankfully, Steam Next Fest is next week again, which is always fun because we get to check out a bunch of upcoming games that we've never seen before, and it's a great reminder of all the cool things people are working on at any given moment in the games industry. We'll also be premiering the Animal World documentary I and other members of Second Wind worked on next week, so keep an eye out for that, and another episode of Unpacked as usual.